My name is Dr. Monique Rideau-Smith. I'm very excited to moderate this panel that are made up of folks who, as Dan has already talked about, have an extensive, extensive body of research and extensive amount of experience in curriculum and assessment, which is what we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to just briefly give you a glimpse into some of the work that they've done, and then we'll get started with our panel. You might notice that Dr. Wayne Au is not here for this panel. He had a family emergency, and so we are sending him our thoughts and our prayers. But Dr. Denisha Jones, a comrade in this struggle and another education justice warrior, stepped in on his behalf in the 11th hour. And so we are so grateful to have her. And so Dr. Denisha Jones is the director of the Art of Teaching program at Sarah Lawrence College in New York. She's a former kindergarten teacher and preschool director who spent the past 16 years in teacher education. She serves as the co-director for Defending the Early Years Incorporated. And since 2017, she served on the steering committee for the National Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action, which we all just hopefully participated in. In 2020, she joined the organizing committee for the Unite to Save Our Schools and co-edited the book that, again, I hope we have all read and have as a part of our libraries, Black Lives Matter at School, an Uprising for Educational Justice. So thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for being here. Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond is also here with us, who is also a former public school teacher. She co-founded an actual preschool and a public high school. She's now professor of education emeritus at Stanford University and founding president of the Learning Policy Institute, which was literally created to do what we are trying to do here today, which is provide high quality research for policies that enable equitable and empowering education for every child. Because she has consulted so widely with federal, state, and local officials and educators, she actually was named in 2006 as one of the most influential people affecting education policy. She led the Obama education policy transition team in 2008 and the Biden administration transition team in 2020. And she currently serves as the president of the California State Board of Education. So welcome, Dr. Darling-Hammond. Thank you so much for being here. We also have with us, thank you, Dr. Scott Marion, who is the president and executive director of the National Center of the Improvement of Educational Assessment. He's a national leader in conceptualizing and designing innovative and balanced assessment systems to support instructional and other critical uses. He's one of 3 measurement specialists on the National Assessment Governing Board, which actually oversees the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which we know as NAEP, as the nation's report card on student academic achievement. Dr. Marion's current projects include designing and supporting states in implementing assessment and accountability initiatives, and what we're very interested in, implementing high quality, locally designed performance-based assessments. So these are our folks, and we can say that they know a thing or two about assessment. So let's just please welcome them and thank them for being here and sharing their experience and their expertise with us. So as Bonita stated earlier, we want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible, because we know that while we have a wealth of knowledge on this panel for sure, there's also a wealth of knowledge among our participants at this event. So before we jump into the first question with our panelists, we're going to start by asking a poll question of all of our participants. So if we can launch that first poll, we're going to try to start our discussion. And that first poll question will be about what is most problematic about standardized testing.
Do we get to vote?
Panelists cannot vote.
No,
No,
not
panelists
Not
cannot
you.
vote.
You gotta get your
I'm
say.
disenfranchised here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so sorry. And it
That's all right.
doesn't seem like our poll is working. So how about we just drop in the chat Let's just drop in the chat right now.
There you go, Linda. You
How
can
are
chat.
people? That's right.
It worked yesterday in the practice run. All that work y'all did. People doesn't want to come
How
up.
it goes. We have teachers. We know what it is. Everything goes great until the evaluation time, and then the wheels fall off. But that's okay.
Years ago, they did studies of what were the predictors of teacher effectiveness, and one of the top ones was flexibility, adaptability. You know,
And absolutely,
Exactly.
that's what we
go
do.
with the flow, right?
Absolutely.
I remember preparing for my first faculty job, and I had to print all my PowerPoint slides on transparencies. In case something, right? You brought the backup back then because you had to be ready that it might not work.
I did that for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing some examples in the chat, things like
There we go.
standardization is the opposite of differentiation, right? We're always pushed to differentiate instruction, but then we get standardized tests, right? Lack of timely or practical results is something else that I'm also seeing. So again, the question is, and we can have someone drop it into the chat, what is problematic about standardized testing? And I'm also going to use this time to remind us that we do have simultaneous translation. So if we can make sure when we're speaking to speak slowly, not too slowly, but slowly enough so that our interpreters are able to get as much of the information as they can and as accurately as they can. So I see things like harm to students' beliefs. Right.
That's
Fear and anxiety.
Fear and anxiety. So let's start then with our panel, and people can keep dropping things into the chat, but because dialogue can be difficult on these virtual platforms, when I ask the question, I'll ask it specifically to one of you on the panel, and then we can open it up if others also want to participate. So I'd like to start with you, Dr. Jones. Especially since the racial reckoning that wasn't in 2020, we've heard the term equity more than ever before, right? It's in our title. We want to advance equity, but rarely does anybody explain it. So can you help us frame this discussion? Why is the issue of student assessment an equity and racial justice issue?
Thank you, Monique, and thanks for everyone. Thanks, Dan, and everyone at Illinois Federation Teachers for inviting me. I will always be a timely replacement for Dr. Waynow whenever I can. So thanks for having me. So I think in that video you were showing earlier, I think was getting at it, right? But I think the history of standardized testing as part of the eugenics movement needs to be reminded as to why it persists as a racial issue, right? And leads to actually racial injustices, right? And so most people know this, right? But standardized testing was created by eugenics to prove racial inferiority. And I don't know, I forget the logical philosophy, what it's called, that issue of logic, right? But when you design something to prove something, guess what it does? It's going to prove that, right? So we have these tests that were created because people believe that there were inferior differences between the races, and they use this. And granted, that might not be what's driving test makers today, right? Not all of them. I have colleagues who work in assessment and they believe in standardized assessment, but it's still the baseline assumption that happens. And so then it creates additional racist ideas. And I want to bring in Ibram Kennedy's work on this because I think he's really showed us how racist ideas come about, right? And why they're so problematic, right? So he says a racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Racial ideas argue that inferiorities and superiorities of racial groups explain racial inequities in society. And that's what standardized testing does in this racist idea called the achievement gap, right? It says that there are these disparities on these tests, and the reason is because this group is not academically as successful as this group based on race. And they might say it's other factors, right, that are causing this. Maybe it's poverty, but they're still using the test to prove this backwards idea, when in fact, the tests are designed to produce a level of inequality, right? Because it's looking at this bell curve and it's saying you're always going to have people distributed on both sides of it, right? And then we get into the idea of, okay, what about let's close the achievement gap? And I was a big proponent of this when I was in grad school. I get really upset now when I think about the 5 years I spent studying this, right? Because that's what everyone gets excited about, right? We can close the achievement gap. but actually you can't. And it becomes a fruitless point of time and actually leads to worse outcomes for these students, right? How do you close a gap in achievement when you can't stop those at the high end from achieving, right? It's like starting a race at different starting points and thinking that this person can eventually catch up without doing anything to stop this person that's ahead. We can't stop people who have the knowledge that's being tested on these tests from doing well. But we think somehow we're going to help these other people catch up. And what does that mean? That means a lot of direct instruction, a lot of these types of scripted curriculums, a lot of assessment. And now we have this amazing research coming out in pre-K, right? I'm in early childhood. This study just came out about pre-K state mandated preschool programs in Tennessee, looking at randomized control and finding that in the beginning, yes, they were doing well. All of the emphasis on discrete knowledge and skills helped in kindergarten. But by the time you get to 6th grade, they're doing worse because they never develop deeper skills than just those surface. So all these attempts at closing the achievement gap are actually worse for children they're targeted to. And who are they targeted to? Poor, low income, Black and brown children, right? So it just becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where you already think something's wrong with those children. And that's number one, that's the problem. You start with the racist idea that there's something wrong with Black and brown children, that there's something wrong with low income children and their families. And then you enact all of these policies based on that racist idea, and you lead to even more troubling outcomes, right? The whole thing is a racial justice issue because from its inception to how it's implemented, even if you have the best intentions in heart, you're still implementing this on bad ideas, right? And then the outcomes are not what you want. And then people say, oh, well, I guess we need more testing. I guess we need more scripted curriculum. I guess we need more, instead of calling into question the entire system. So I know I talk fast, so I'm going to stop there and let the interpreters catch up and let one of my other colleagues talk about this as well.
And that's what I'm doing right now, just trying to allow for a little bit of space. We're going to continue talking about this because, again, we're going to frame this discussion around equity and around being a racial justice issue. But you just talked about how what happens is that deep learning actually gets lost because there is a focus on just trying to get these basic skills. So Dr. Darling-Hammond, I'm going to ask you then the next question about what do we actually mean by deep learning? What does that mean? What does that actually look like?
So starting as I was a high school English teacher also, Dan, years ago. And one of the things that high school English teachers care about is how do people express their thoughts in writing and in speaking, and how do we engage in communication? And those are tools for analysis. Those are tools for thinking through and weighing and balancing and how to use as evidence and all those things. Those are all elements of deeper learning. There are elements of deeper learning in every content area that have to do with how we are able to use knowledge for our own purposes. When we talk about empowering education, it's being able to deeply understand and then be able to use knowledge to do things in our lives and at some point in our professions and so on. Transferable knowledge requires deeper learning. If somebody just tells you something and you memorize it for a test and spit it back and you never use it, it disappears. It's not part of your actual capacity to, retrieve and use. And then you have to figure out how the different things come together in ways that allow you to analyze more deeply, et cetera. So testing by itself, I want to just do a +1 on one of the things that, there's several of the things that Denisha said, but the kinds of tests we have in the United States, which transformed when they crossed the ocean from France, where Benet was doing some of the first testing design, and he was trying to figure out whether there were kids in French society who couldn't profit from the traditional public schools that they were creating and would need something else. And he came out of his assessment saying, almost all the kids know almost all the stuff they need to know. It was when it came across the ocean, unfortunately, to a group of folks at Stanford, where I have been working for a number of years, that it was turned into norm reference testing to put everyone on a bell curve to do, to select and sort. And it was an explicit goal of the test to do selecting and sorting and to make sure that you create this artificial bell curve. And the way you do that is by having items that have discriminatory power, and that's a double entendre. The items have to both put people along the bell curve, so you can't have the items that most people know the answers to. And then you have to decide which ones matter. In the first round of a test that they created, Terman and others, girls did better than boys. They said, oh my gosh, the test is wrong. We've got to change the test to demonstrate that, in fact, the order of things is what it should be. And it was eugenicists engaged in it who would use the results to say, in fact, at that time, they were labeling Eastern Europeans as mentally deficient. And then below that would be, you know, as they put it in one of the quotes, Indians and Negroes, and they would go on and on about who should be placed in what programs in school. That's how tracking got created. It's, you know, it's all part of that. So I just want to say that that part of it is the commitment to the bell curve, which is not something that we, you know, it is an artificial construct. It's the nature of the tests. Multiple choice testing is very, it was a 1950s technology that came in the United States and allowed for more selecting and more sorting in the Army and other places. Most countries do not test with multiple choice items exclusively, or in some cases at all. They don't test every year. They don't use the test to label and sort schools and decide which ones are going to be, you know, blown up or put on some kind of a, you know, an intervention program. There are tests that are used in other countries that are used to determine, you know, pathways for kids, usually in high school. But increasingly, that's less the case, less and less the case. We do more tracking in the United States now than most high achieving countries around the world, and we do it sooner because where the sort occurs in most places is 10th grade or later, where kids are picking vocations and pathways. So I just want to put that the part of the problem is that we have tests that do not measure deeper learning. The multiple choice items typically ask you to, and of course, kids get a lot of practice on, okay, eliminate this one, it's obviously wrong. You know, these two could possibly be right. And if you don't know the answer, guess between the two of them, right? It's like not a deeper learning process. In fact, I think it's cognitively damaging to spend years and years and years on high stakes tests, which kids and teachers know have a lot of impact on what programs you'll get into, whether you can get promoted to the next grade. There was a period of time for teachers where it could determine your pay, it could determine your employment. For schools, it could determine whether the school lived on, you know, into the next year. So those tests, if they were not being used in those ways, we could ignore the fact that they have the way they influence instruction. They wouldn't have as much influence. But because of all the stakes and because they're very narrow, and not organized to measure deeper learning, they then push the curriculum in the wrong direction. Other countries test differently. So in Singapore, almost all the assessments are open-ended. If you're learning, if you're being assessed, and there's few of them, there's some in 6th grade, there's some at 10th grade, and then there are qualifying exams in high school, which is something you'll see in much of Europe and Asia, particularly in Asia. And they're open-ended, so if you're being tested on writing, you're writing. If you're being assessed for speaking, you're actually, you know, doing your English and other language assessments are oral language assessments where you're actually using the language. When you're being assessed for science in high school, you design a science experiment, you conduct that experiment, and you write up the results, and that is assessed by teachers. In that country, and Australia and Canada and many other countries, teachers are part of the process. The assessments are designed by teachers in consultation with assessment experts. They score the assessments, and they are part of teaching and learning. And we did this in the 1990s. So Dan's history took us back about 20 years. But before that, the assessments typically were some kind of standardized tests once every 3rd year in the grade span. Many of those had open-ended items on them, as well as multiple choice items. And then there were performance tests in many states. So in Kentucky, as part of your English classroom, you would do a writing portfolio, and kids would have to do a persuasive essay, or they'd have to do some other kind. And there were structured, standardized not prompts, but criteria. and rubrics so that they could be scored reliably and it could be used comparably. But the kids could choose what topic they were going to write about, or how that was going to, teacher could choose how to integrate it into the classroom instruction. So there are other options that are closer to measuring deeper learning, but right now we are not using them, and that's a function of both the policy framework federally and the way states are implementing it.
Thank you so much. I want Dr. Marion to be able to also get in on this conversation just about, again, what deep learning is. Dr. Darling-Hammond has already started talking to us about alternatives that could actually measure deep learning. So I want you to also just weigh in on this conversation about what actually is deep learning and how can we actually be assessing it? How could our assessment practices actually promote that kind of learning?
Yeah, and so Linda gave a great definition about this importance of usable knowledge. It's often characterized. You think about experts who, when you're playing chess with a chess master, they don't see the next move. They see the end of the game already, right? Because they have a deep understanding of chess and a schema, and they're able to recognize new situations and think about how to apply their knowledge in new situations. Now, we don't expect all second graders to be chess masters or something like that, right? But people say, oh, kids need to learn the basic skills first before they learn deeper learning, and that's a terrible fallacy, because a lot of kids get tracked into learning basic skills forever and never get to go beyond. There's one of the best syntheses now. It's a National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics redid the famous National Research Council volume called How People Learn. It's How People Learn Too. It's very accessible book. So if people really want an understanding, and this is framed in a much more sociocultural perspective, we learn with others. We rely on others. We learn in social situations. We learn how to become masters from being apprentices to people with a lot more experience. But the key thing about deeper learning, there's many key things, is people just can't learn something once here in class and then have deep knowledge unless there's some kind of really special person, right? It takes multiple representations. It takes multiple opportunities to see things in new situations and think about how to apply things in non-algorithmic ways. Now, sometimes you'll discover an algorithm because it's more efficient. We want to see instructional tasks that call for that kind of deeper learning, the kind of science experiments Linda was talking about. But then we also want to see the same thing reflected on assessment tasks. And actually, the way we say it, my good friend and Linda's good friend, Laura Shepard, always talks about this, that if you took away the scoring, a really good assessment task would be no different than something you would just use in instruction. Right. And that's always the simple test for me. If you wouldn't use this test question as an instructional activity, it's a crappy test question. Don't use it, right? That's one way to check really quickly. I will say, since I am the director of the Center for Assessment and I'm on the National Assessment Governing Board, there is a role for monitoring assessments. Part of the challenge that we're all facing, and Dan talked about the 21-year reign of terror, it has been about this accountability use in ways that don't make sense. Now, not all accountability is necessarily bad. We have for certain reasons. Many of the situations Linda was talking about tests in Europe and Australia, they're very high stakes for kids at the end to get into college or get into other types of programs. But their accountability is okay when you have a chance to succeed. When your success is not just based on where you happen to be living. So, but I do think there is a role for monitoring assessments. I have to say that as part of my National Assessment Governing Board role, that we want to be able to track progress as systems over time, because states have responsibility, constitutional responsibility for education. We want to see if states are fulfilling that responsibility. It's hard to do that aggregating up classroom by classroom. That said, I really strongly believe that the work has to start in the classrooms, and then we look at what school districts and states are doing to support the work in the classrooms. Well, I could go on forever, as all of us can, so I'll just stop.
Could I just add something
Yeah.
about the monitoring role, which I think is really important? But it's taking all the air out of the room right now.
That's right.
You know, the NAEP is a matrix sample test. You know, a sample of kids take a sample of items and then they add it up. And we could do that. We were allowed to do that back in the 90s. We're not allowed to do it now under the federal law. So, and when NAEP was invented by Ralph Tyler and others way back in the day, it was performance assessment. Kids who were doing, they had music and kids were doing music, and they had art and kids were doing art, and, you know, they had open-ended, kids were doing writing. By the way, we haven't measured writing on NAEP since 2007 or something.
Right.
So now it's all about, can you respond to the multiple choice questions on the reading test? So there are options of ways to do some monitoring assessment periodically.
Mhm.
And it could be more representative of authentic tasks
That's
than
right.
it currently is. But when you say you have to test every kid every year, the cost of then also maintaining open-ended items and all the rest of it is something that becomes more challenging to do. It's not impossible. We also had a moment in the Bush administration when No Child Left Behind came by, when states that were doing this, Connecticut had science tasks that kids were doing in the classroom, and Maryland had all kinds of interesting tasks, and so did Kentucky. And they did not approve those plans from those states. Connecticut sued them and said, we want to keep our performance assessments going. And they said, no, let them eat multiple choice tests, basically. So this has been contended.
That's right.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to go now and just try to get some input from our participants. Since we're talking about deep learning, we're talking about what are the assessment practices that can promote deep learning. Let's just go to our participants and ask the question of, how do you assess, or how do you know that your students are learning? Or if you're a parent, how do you determine if your child is learning? If you're a student, how do you know when you're really learning something? So let's just take a few seconds to let people respond to that down in the chat. I see already listening to students. So what methods, again, do you use to determine if students are learning? I see one-on-one conversations. And we're talking both. We're talking about summative and also formative, right? How do you know that students are comprehending, understanding what it is that they're learning and are able to apply it, since that's a part of deep learning? You're seeing some of the things that have already been brought forth in the conversation, right? Getting multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning. So let's get deeper into some of the common practices, right? Like, one of the catalysts for us really coming together around this conversation was, as Dan mentioned earlier, the idea of interim assessments, and the idea of saying, we won't wait until the end of the year to do a test that takes a week. We'll do the shorter tests throughout the year, right? And many districts across the nation, especially after, Race to the Top, began using interim assessments. I believe the Illinois State Board of Education reports that 70% of districts right here in Illinois are using some kind of interim system. And again, that is a system in which students usually are tested multiple times throughout the year. And in the proposal initially was about, in grades 3 through 8, that students would be tested 3 times a year, in the fall, winter, and spring. So that's about every 10 weeks. And that there will also be optional testing for kindergarten to second graders. So our question is, and Dr. Marion, I'm going to just direct this one with you first, is since you do work on creating balanced assessment systems, can you just talk about what you found in regards to interim testing systems, since that is such a common practice? Can you just talk to us about the way in which those systems either do or do not support deep learning?
Yeah, this is a long running interest, I would say, of mine. And there's a few different flavors of these interim assessments, I should say. So there's the one that we think of most commonly that's given fall, winter, and spring generally. And they're built to look like the end of year summative assessment in terms of what we call the blueprint, or how we decide which questions to ask and what categories of knowledge or standards and what skills. And in a sense, all these instances, fall, winter, and spring, reflect this end of year blueprint. And you first think about that, you say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I didn't teach this thing. I'm not going to teach this thing till the spring, but I'm being tested on it in the fall. Now, people will say, well, we have these adaptive tests and they adapt up and down, but that's still assuming a certain progression is not there. So, I one of my big concerns with interim assessments is the teachers should not have to ask a question when interpreting the results. Did I even teach this area yet? They should be tested on things that they know that they were instructed. Now, there are, as another flavor of interim assessments that we named modular interim assessments. They'd be tied to a fancy statistical name, chunks of content, right? That that you taught. So I taught adding and subtracting fractions in October. I might have a modular interim assessment tied specifically to that. The problem in all these cases, except in very rare instances, is that at best, they're tied to the state standards. That's rarely the case. They're often tied to some other abstraction of learning that they're made up by these companies, that, not to say they're indefensible, but they're not tied to what I'm teaching in my classroom. And if you think about this as a teacher, there's, I've written a lot about what does it take for an assessment to inform instruction. The one thing is got to be really related to the instruction you're giving, right? It sounds so simple, and it is, right? And so I need an interpretive framework to understand the results. And what's a good interpretive framework? High quality curriculum, high quality instructional materials. So I know that if I'm teaching a unit in a certain way, I was a biology teacher, if I'm teaching a unit on ecology in a certain way, right? And I get an assessment that's entirely different, I could see that my kids didn't do well on this or did do, but I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do next because I don't have an interpretive frame, and that's where I need the curriculum. So that's the problem we've seen in all these cases, is that they're not tied close enough to curriculum to inform instruction. The final thing I'll say, I think there's a tremendous opportunity cost with these, because people do these funny, because this is what they're told to do, groupings and regroupings of kids based on unreliable subscores. And I mean that seriously, they are unreliable subscores. And they group kids thinking that this is a sensible grouping, when in fact, they're often grouping on error. And so it just, and they're wasting time analyzing results that they could be the oracle, and they will not be able to discern anything instructionally useful out of these things. And so that's, to me, is the problem. They're not spending time on closely understanding where their students are relative to the curriculum instruction that the kids are experiencing. And they're spending time on these things that just can't get close enough. I'm gonna stop.
Can I make a note about
I
the
knew
fact
that I would get you.
Oh no,
Linda and I do this a lot together.
And I agree with everything that Scott just said. One of the other things, though, that you'll hear a lot of terms. You'll hear interim assessment, you'll hear through course assessment, you'll hear, all kinds of things. And people use these terms in ways that get confusing and often, that they are confused about. But many assessment systems, both around the world and in places like International Baccalaureate systems or even AP courses, will have tasks during the year that are performance
That's
tasks.
right.
And so this is, I just want to distinguish it from the type of interim that
Right.
Scott is talking about. And he's talking about the more common experience.
Commercial available ones.
Yeah,
That's
the
right.
commercially available ones. But you can, and just like I said here in Kentucky, they had the writing portfolio. The teacher would decide over the course of the year, there were 3 tasks that kids would do. And they had, persuasive essay and narrative, whatever. They had genres and they had criteria and rubrics. You could decide when to do it, fit it into your instruction at the right moment. It felt like to Scott's earlier mention of Lori's definition, it felt like instruction. Kids are doing things that they would normally be doing. It just so happened that people took them off and scored them. That is a different kind of instructional approach that does, some people might put it under an interim or through course title, but it is doing something different. And there's a lot more teacher control and student engagement around those kinds of tasks.
Monique, could I just add one little thing? This is so. I'm embarrassed to almost say this, but it was my 2 colleagues, Marion Perry and Brian Gong, and I invented the term interim assessments because we were trying to keep the commercial vendors out of trying to claim the formative assessment literature for which there is good research base. I will tell you that we completely failed because people use the term. So I've given up on trying to come up with common terminology because it gets, once you have money attached to it, people will co-opt it any way they can. So,
that's very interesting because I see the focus on interim assessments as a response to like opt-out movements where we were saying just opt out of that yearly standardized testing, and now they're like, oh, we've got that answer. It's called interim testing. You can't opt out when the testing is happening 3 times a year, right? And so it's very interesting how they do co-opt these great terms we come up with and put them into other processes that not what we had in mind. Right?
Yeah. Best intentions.
I actually was just going to ask you, Dr. Jones, to speak to that, right? In Illinois, just using, our state as an example with these commercialized interim assessments, we've actually seen in our largest school districts a drop in student scores on these tests over time, right? And so in Chicago, they have actually this year not renewed their contract for the interim test that they were using with high stakes accountability. It was again used for teacher evaluation. It was used to retain or promote students, but they have discontinued using that system this year. So Dr. Jones, just wanting to know, again, talking about equity, right? If we know that there are so many problems and challenges with these kinds of systems, why do you think that there is still the tendency for districts to pour so much money and local dollars, state dollars into these kind of commercialized systems that actually have no validity? They have no evidence that they actually help to improve teaching and learning, and actually we're seeing that it's causing the opposite effect.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot about what Linda and Scott both said, right? Like in many ways, states do have a responsibility to show evaluation metrics, right? To measure students' knowledge and show students are doing this. And as a whole, the country might want to do that and compare itself to other people. And it's hard, standardized testing is efficient in the sense that you can mass give it out to people, you can collect an aggregate number, you can run all sorts of quantitative analysis and get something, where performance-based tasks, open-ended portfolios, they're harder to do on a mass scale, right? And so I think there's that, and the testing companies lobby for this because they make a huge profit off of these types of things, right? Pearson and other companies, so they have a lot to gain from keeping these going. And then there's that belief that, Linda called it the bell curve of social construction. Well, a lot of people have a zealous belief in that and they want to hold on to it because some people like being positioned on the high end of that, right? The first time I did a public talk on testing, it was with NPR, the host was like, well, I did good on standardized tests. Why would I want to get rid of them? And that's key, right? Those who benefit from these systems are in no position to want to get rid of them, right? Some people want to prove that their kids are smarter than other kids and their kids deserve this than other children, right? So they rely on these. And people believe that's how our society should operate, right? That we should have these outcomes because they're natural, but they're not, right? They're socially constructed based on the things that we value and the things that we put forth. But I think for me, and listening to both Scott and Linda, one of the issues I think is this idea of assessment to measure knowledge and assessment to document knowledge, right? And so whether the state and the country has a legitimate expectation to measure knowledge, that is their right if they feel that. Should that be what schools and teachers are about, right? Should we be measuring knowledge or documenting knowledge, right? And so I always go back to the fact that assess, right? The word assess is a Latin word that also means to sit beside, right? So the idea that you will sit beside someone and also to judge them, right? But to document what they're doing. Imagine of schools where the teacher wasn't showing, I know this child knows how to, I measured this child's knowledge, but instead says, this child can do this because I've seen it and I've witnessed this and this is how, right? And when you're focusing on documenting what students can do, right? Not measuring them against each other or against some other, universal standards, right? You're shifting that equity lens into the sense where I'm not showing what you can't do or what you should be able to. I'm showing what you actually can do at this moment, at this time. And I think that is more valuable for teachers and schools in general, right? So in early childhood, a lot of programs that I'm working with, right, they're more about play-based and discovery, not even play-based, just play, right? Open-ended, free play and discovery. So I asked one of my colleagues, Keisha Reed, who runs this amazing discovery place in Maryland, when you bring in student teachers, right, from the colleges, how do you help them? Because don't they have to create a lesson plan? And she goes, yeah, they're supposed to. So they come in and I tell them to just observe the children playing all day. And then at the end, document what you saw. So it's like that reverse planning. I don't come in and tell you what I'm going to do with the kids all day. I'm going to let the kids do what they do all day. And then I'm going to tell you what I saw them doing, what they were learning, what they were actually able to do in that moment. That is so much more beneficial than coming in with this preconceived notion of what I think you should be doing, giving you that in many different ways, and then measuring at the end whether you met my goals and my expectations, right? Children can do so much when we step back and we observe them and we document their learning, but that's a shift, right? That's a big shift for teachers and school systems, right? Some people are ready for it. They want to do that. Some people don't know how. And part of that is, are we preparing them in teacher ed to do that? No, right? We're not, right? Some programs are. We are at Sarah Lawrence because we believe in observing children deeply and getting to know them really well is how you guide your pedagogy, right? But in other programs, they're not, because we rely on the easy, efficient, standardized testing, right? And it's not easy, as we saw in the comments. Interim testing is not easy and standardized, but it's the system that we've created instead of thinking, what are other systems? So to get at that deep learning, right? That deep engagement, I think we have to shift our idea on what is the purpose of assessment. It's too much used as a gotcha tool. Gotcha, you don't know that. Gotcha, you can't do what they can do, instead of saying, let's document what you can do. And I think parents want that. They want to know, what can their kids do? What drives their kids? What are they motivated by? Not so much whether they're good at this compared to that. That doesn't help them, right? And so, but it requires a big shift.
And just to add some tools to what you're saying, Denisha, if you think about in Illinois, this is also being used, the developmental results, desired results developmental progress, so the DRDP is used in early childhood, and it's an observational tool. And we use it in California too, but also tells you what to teach next. So it's not just observing and documenting, it's also saying, oh, you can do this. What we know about learning, of course, you teach within the zone of proximal development. You see where the child is, and then you lean into the next place where they can grow and build on what they already know. And when you build on what you already know, you have a stronger foundation. So there are some tools like the DRDP that are used in early childhood. In some elementary schools, you'll see the developmental reading assessment, where teachers sit beside to take the assess term, and they do miscue analyses of the students' reading. They talk to them about books that they've read or stories that they've read. They get an assessment of their comprehension. They figure out what texts they have been reading and what they could read next, etc. And they keep track of it, and it can actually be scored in a reliable and valid way along a scale if you want to watch progress as well. But it is about documenting and then teaching from. And I think that's a very important construct and that's what quote, diagnostic assessments should be, I'm going to poke Scott because he hates that word. But that's what a diagnostic assessment should be trying to do, is try to say, where are you? Everybody's motivated by being able to do the next thing they're ready to do. Nobody is motivated by being told you're deficient and then stuck in some place where you're doing drill and kill, around those deficiencies. So it's, critical to the motivational side of teaching and learning as well.
So this is all wonderful. We are all loving these paradigm shifts and doing something different, but we also can't act as if there aren't forces and structures and barriers that are in the way of doing the kinds of things that you all are describing here. We can't act as if we haven't been immersed in this kind of testing culture and regime for decades now. So we're going to ask for our participants again to drop into the chat. This will be kind of our final question, because we want to move to this kind of framing, right? But we have to do some things in order to get there. So the question is, what conditions are necessary for states and districts to build assessment systems that support deep learning in schools and classrooms? What are the conditions that are going to have to change, right, for us to do the kinds of things that you all have just been talking about? So thank you. Amy Alsop just dropped it into the chat. We have another early childhood educator. Mary was right on it. She said time, right? Need time to be able to do these kinds of things. Right, needing preparation. So since we have about 8 or so minutes left, and I would like all of you to weigh in on this question, we'll keep letting the chat keep going and let folks drop into the chat. But I want to pose that question to you all. What are the conditions that are going to be necessary for states and districts to build assessment systems that really support deep learning in schools and classrooms? Anybody want to jump in first?
I think Scott should jump in first.
Okay. I mean, the conditions, I taught high school, and, if you're teaching 200 kids a day, 150 kids a day, and you're trying to do things that require, we need different ways of thinking about everything from student grading to things like comparability. So I always say to teachers, you don't have to have all 200 kids do a performance assessment today. Do one section, of your classes doing performance assessments, but teachers need at the local level. I think this has to start locally, and those of us who are involved in writing about the assessment of the next generation science standards back in 2014, we said it has to start with the classroom and then build out, because if we come in from the state level and say, these are the new expectations, they're often going to be beyond what kids and teachers are ready for. So we can't treat this as we're going to fix this from the top down. We're pretty good at screwing things up from the top down, and it's really hard to fix things from the top down. So we have to build the structures locally. What does that mean? That means teachers might need some outside expertise, but might need certainly support professional learning communities to examine student work. How do I know if the stuff that I'm getting out of my kids is any good? But if I'm sitting next to Linda and I say, wow, how'd you get your kids to do that? And then, so I actually learn not just about assessment, I learn about instruction and instructional moves to help me get there. So you need to build really strong professional learning communities and think about the kinds, and don't try to do it all at once. To expect everybody to reform everything at once is asking a lot. And so start locally, and then what at the district level could support this? So nobody said it yet, but I mean, you guys have heard of Chicago, right? It's in your state, right? They have one of the best projects going on right now, the Curriculum and Equity Initiative, Skyline. that is building from the ground up high quality instructional materials with embedded assessments that will give teachers a framework for doing it. So districts have to really take the lead on this because they control curriculum, they control professional development, they control teacher contracts, they, all these things that go to building a balanced assessment system. And then the state will have to say, all right, I guess we're going to try to support that in a way that makes sense, because if you had all the districts on board doing really rich local assessments. So what does it look like at the classroom level? How can districts best support that? And then look to the state to perhaps continue to support it with resources, expertise, monitoring. But that's, I know we're running out of time. Go ahead, Linda, or Denise.
I'd like to start from the top down since you started from the bottom up.
Okay, this is a little role
because I
reversal.
think there is a role that states need to take to make room
That's
for
right.
this.
Yes.
And so we can kind of make the top down and the bottom up kind of meet in the middle, hopefully. I mean, one thing the state can do is reduce the stakes associated with testing.
That's right.
So right now, the Department of Education put out FAQs, frequently asked questions of their, about accountability and assessment plans, and they've invited states to rethink their accountability systems and to put more measures of opportunity to learn into their dashboards or whatever their structure is, and to rethink, for example, early on. Right now, states are operating under guidelines from another administration that sort of say reading and math are the only two subjects that matter, and they have to be 80% of the score, and then you got to use that in some way to identify schools for intervention. In some states, that is being done in a way that reduces. In California, we've got a whole dashboard, and we don't we use it in a way that minimizes the effect of the test scores. But a lot of states want to say, well, science should count, college and career readiness should count, graduation rate should count as part of achievement. And we should also be measuring school climate, and we should be looking at, a variety of other things. If the test scores are 80% of what counts for your school, and then you've got narrow tests, the tail is wagging the dog. So first, reduce the stakes, build out a more thoughtful accountability dashboard that focuses on what kids get the opportunity to learn, as well as other things that they do with learning other than tests. College and career readiness in California includes seal of civic engagement, seal of biliteracy, college and career, career technical pathways and linked learning pathways, and a variety of things that are what kids get access to and can do other than test scores. Second, you can begin to reduce the footprint of the tests and not adopt interims of the sort that Scott was criticizing earlier, such that you've got a narrow test and then you do it 3 times a year. And so then it sucks up all the, air in the room for teaching. But I know some states now are reducing the size of their end of year test. Some are looking at, could they get to matrix sampling? Could they get permission from the federal government to do that? I mean, there's a lot of, disruption right now. States are going to be able to, over the next couple of years, propose some innovations and thinking about what those might be. And are there performance tasks that might be part of a system if you want something happening during the year? We're working at LPI with a group of states who are interested in science performance assessments, and they're building a bank of tasks that are kids engaging in real inquiry science, linked to the NGSS standards that you could use any grade level. Any teacher could use these, kind of like what Scott was describing in Chicago, that having the tasks right there and you can choose them. But some are also looking to embed those along with their science assessments. People are talking about, in a couple of states, going back to a writing portfolio and using that as part of the ELA. So there are different ways to approach it, but there is a top-down piece that opens up the room. In terms of what's needed, also teachers need professional development time. I spent a long time in New York. They do Regents. They've been doing Regents exams since, 1700.
Since I was a kid.
Yeah, before you were a kid, way before. This came from Europe. It's the same kind of blue book exam you see in all the British colonies and in UK and so on, and they start out being written exams. But the point is that teachers get professional development days, and they score these exams at the end of the year. Many of them are open-ended, and there's time and training to score them. And when people in Vermont and Kentucky had the writing portfolio, there was state funded time for teachers to be involved in the scoring process. So a few things that are practical to get the wheels greased.
Thank you. Dr. Jones?
Yeah, I don't know where my remarks fall in between Linda and Scott's, because they're not really state or district, but in between, right? Thinking about more society, what we can do in society to support this, and then what teachers can also do, right? But I think it falls down into two areas, right? We need to trust our teachers, and then teachers and us, we need to trust our students as well too, right? So we would be remiss not to mention that we're in a current time where over 14, 15 states are enacting legislation to prevent teachers from doing their job, right? From teachers to be able to teach the truth about the history of this country in ways that matter, or banning books, or even now surveilling teachers, right? That shows a lack of trust for teachers. And we can't do equitable assessments if we don't trust the educators. A lot of our problems is that we want a foolproof assessment because we don't trust teachers to do anything. We don't trust teachers to measure it properly. We think there's going to be bias if they're measuring the assessments and doing the teaching, right? We don't fully trust them. So I think we need to think about as a society, how can we show our trust and belief in teachers that they know, they're trained, they go to school, they're educated, they know what they're doing, and we're going to support them and do it in ways. And I think Linda mentioned that, right? Other countries who assessments are created with teachers, not for teachers, right? We need to shift that thinking where teachers need to be put in positions where they can lead this work because they know what kind of assessments they need, but they often don't get that because of the lack of trust. And then we all need to trust students as well too, right? And give them the autonomy to show us what they can do and to show us what they've learned, right? Maybe I'm fortunate because I can do this at a university, but I also didn't always do this in college. I used to come in very strict. Here's our PowerPoint. Here's your work you have to do. Here's the activities. Here's the point structure. I'm at Sarah Lawrence, and that's very different now. And so I realized I want to trust the students more to show me what they can do. So what does that look like in my class? I don't have a set of assignments you need to do. I have 5 expectations that you need to meet throughout the year because those are the skills I'm looking for you to do. I need you to collaborate with someone else in this class on something related to the topic. I need you to research and write on something related to the topic. That could be done through collaboration if you want. I need you to reflect on some of the essential questions we're going through this semester, right? And show me. You can do that as a presentation. You can do that written. You can do that orally, right? I need you to participate, be a part of the class, demonstrate your thinking and learning to me as well too, right? And so it gives them that freedom to do that in many different ways. And at first they're stuck because they're used to being told, do this assignment in this way. And now I'm giving them all this, but then they get into it and they're like, wait, I could do this in multiple ways. I'm like, yes, if you're really smart, you can meet 4 of these expectations in one thing. That's okay. It's okay for you to do that, right? Because you're being creative, right? But it gives them that autonomy that they need to really show me what they're learning. At the end of the day, I don't know if they've learned what I want them to learn or what I think they should learn unless they have an opportunity to show it to me. And I don't want to read 20 pages of the same thing. No teacher wants to grade 200 of the same thing, right? And now I don't have to, right? I have a podcast I need to listen to because that's what one student did, right? I have other things, that I get at different times. It makes it so much easier for me in terms of managing the course because I get different things at different ways. And I get really excited about the things. They often teach me a lot of things, right? In our conference system where they are doing work throughout the semester and we're meeting. I learned so much. But that's a shift, right? I had to shift. I'm in my 3rd year now and I'm embracing that more and I'm shifting my idea of what does it mean to document students' learning? What does it mean? It means trusting them, right? Putting forth, this is what I need you to be able to do. Now do it. And show it to me and make that matter. And they take a lot more ownership in that learning instead of students being responsible for teachers being responsible for students learning. Let's let our students be responsible for that learning too. That's what they're going to need, right? In the society, they're going to need those types of skills. So I don't know if they're not just state policies or local, right, or national, but it's more of the relational approach to this work. How we see ourselves doing this work, I think is super important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been so very rich. If folks could just drop down in the chat and thank our panelists. This just went super fast. I don't know if it went fast for anybody else, but it went incredibly fast for me. But you really have allowed us or prepared us for our next group of panelists who are going to be teachers and students showing us what they have been able to do in their classrooms. And so that's a perfect segue.
They'll
We
correct
really
all the
have-
things we said, so that's good.
Yes, we do, right? But we definitely have a better idea of what deep learning is and that there are alternatives, right? That standardized testing isn't the only way for us to be able to determine what
That's right.
students actually know, and that we can't rely on commercial vendors to give us some silver bullet on assessment to be the end all be all, but we need to think more about how do we start with classrooms? How do we start allowing time for educators to be able to collaborate, to be able to have the time to actually allow students the space to show them what it is that they know. Professional learning. We know in Illinois, there's $228 million on the table for a possible interim, commercialized interim testing system, but perhaps we need to use those monies for the kinds of things we talked about here: professional development for teachers, allowing time and space, lowering class sizes so that teachers actually have the time to do individualized instruction. So thank you so very much for your time, for your expertise, for your experience. Thank you so very much again for being here and sharing all of that with us.